Hello, board members and trustees. Welcome to the session on leveraging technology to close the student opportunity gap. My name is Michael Strange. I'm a trustee in Kennedale ISD and also a former secondary teacher for 15 years. In the last 3 years, I've been in Dallas ISD as a blended learning and personalized learning coordinator. So let's jump in. So we want to norm on expectations real quick, kind of what is this session going to be about? We're going to focus on a few things. One, building knowledge on blended learning and distance learning to help you as board members understand the effective models for their school district. This time is not differentiated. We will all be learning together the same. You'll receive access to the slides later in the presentation. And of course, this session is pre-recorded. And so we will set aside time for Q&A at the end, a live Q&A at the end. Our objectives for this session, the first one is, again, gain better understanding of what blended learning is in today's classroom, and then also define distance learning, knowing the COVID environment that we were in this spring, and then what that might look like this fall, and how distance learning can be a good way to adapt to that. We also wanted to explore the constraints and benefits of a virtual environment, things that may be helpful for students and teachers, and then things that may be constraints to them. And then lastly, I'm a big believer in experiencing something new to be able to create something new. So in this case, for you to really understand what blended learning is or a distance learning environment, then you need to experience it. So one of the last things you'll do is I'll take you through an individual rotation model where we'll explore lessons learned, as well as go back through this slide deck. And real quick on that item there, if you see this icon here at the top right of one of the slides, that means that that's going to connect back to the learning menu, which I'll explain later. So how we'll spend our time today, the first 5 minutes just spending time here, going over expectations and objectives. We'll spend 15 minutes to do a quick overview of what blended learning and distance learning looks like. 10 minutes spending some time over lessons learned in both a large district and a small district. And then 15 minutes time on your own, an individual rotation time. Again, I'll explain that later. We may go through that a little bit faster than that, since there's no real, typically there's kind of a back and forth. And since it's just me talking, it may be faster than this, which I'm sure you won't complain about. But then the last bit of our time, we'll do that live Q&A with the TASB facilitator. Okay, so empowering student learning. To kind of help us frame this, we want to think about the way we were taught, the way we learned, to where the kids are, students are nowadays, even with this brand new environment, right? This COVID environment. So to do that, let's think about what it was before. So think about what that image is there. Of course, that is the TV, right? With the old knobs. I remember changing those knobs. And when the knob broke, you had to get the pliers and that was the knob. This was the telephone back then. I had one of these in my house. My dad was a youth football coach, and many times I can remember him when we brought students over to waiting for mom and dad to come pick them up. He would leave that one in the kitchen and tell them to go call their parents and just watch them struggle. Like, I don't even know where the buttons there, right? But of course, this is the TV for students now. Way different. Lots more options, a lot more choices. And then the phone, as we know, is not just a phone anymore. There's so much more in there. So knowing that, how can we leverage technology to give students agency in their learning? And I do want to pause real quick and note that you see this icon here. So when you go back to your learning menu later during your individual rotation time, that question will be posed there for you to reflect back on. And then there's also a link to help you define student agency if you'd like to do that. So before we jump into the different blended learning and distance learning model environments, we want to take a second and define what learning looks like um, this last spring, and then what it might look like even going into this next fall. So there's three of them, three big buckets. Of course, there's face-to-face, which is in a traditional classroom setting with the teacher on a campus, students in the class. There's distance learning, where this happens outside of the school facility when the learning plans and schedules are still being created by the teacher for every class. The teacher is still helping to drive that. But we really weren't this last spring in that learning and distance learning environment. We were in an at-home learning environment where the learning plans were primarily created by at the district level. Teachers obviously had some wiggle room to pivot and make changes, but the district itself was setting something for all grade levels to some degree, and activities and tasks were really being guided now by the parent. The parent was helping to manage the time, or the families were helping to manage students' time. Whereas again, in the distance learning, this would be done by the teacher. So I think it's important to pause for a second. And there is a difference between distance learning and the at-home learning environment that we were all just experiencing. So going into blended learning, this is not simply adding technology. I think that's an important piece to note. Sometimes when you hear the words blended learning and personalized learning, we automatically think technology. It's not just about adding technology, but about shifting the teaching practice. And so you're going to see a picture here, and I want you to think about, is this blended learning? And the quick answer is no, it's not blended learning. We're going to go into the details in that in a second, but essentially you can see most students are doing the same activity, sitting at their desk, just like they would be if they were doing a pencil and paper activity or reading a book. All we've done is simply replace the book with a computer, and that is not blended learning. So the definition of blended learning from the Clayton Christensen Institute, which is linked right here. It's a good source for you if you want to dive deeper into it. Is any formal education program where a student learns at least in part through online learning and obviously face-to-face. And there's four really key elements to help you decide, is this a true blended learning environment? And that is, the student has some control over the time, the path, the pace, and the place in their learning throughout that time. So specifically then, we've kind of called that TP3. Like, that's just an easy way to remember that, TP3. And again, you see that menu up there, so you're going to see that question later in your individual rotation time. So time, path, pace, or place. Does the student have some control over a few of those aspects? That would then be a good idea if it's blended learning or not. So a more in-depth version of that then, some examples for that: controlling time. A student is able to do like Achieve 3000 or Imagine Math or Study Island. There's so many adaptive softwares now. A lot of teachers have used those in this past spring in the COVID environment. So the program is allowing the student to go faster or slower based on their needs and interests. The student has some control over path. So the teacher is not the driver in every single thing that they need to do. The student has some control to move around, choose different tasks. You've seen this with, maybe you've heard words like playlist or choice boards, or today you're going to do this in the idea of a learning menu. The student has some control over place. We're not just sitting at our desk all the time. Now, this obviously there's a little caveat, right, with COVID. So what that looks like in your district may be different, but we had flexible seating. Students don't have to just sit at their desk. We can sit on the floor. We can sit in the hallway. In the case of at-home learning, they were, who knows where they sit. They could have been anywhere in the house, right? And then control over pace. So you're seeing that now by watching this video, and you can go back and rewind or fast forward things that you may have missed or you want to skip past. And this is a really key driver in the blended learning environment, especially with distance learning as well, is that the student has the chance to get on-demand instruction. And we do that all the time because, in my case, if there's something I need to fix in the house, what's the first thing I do? Go to YouTube, right? And I just watch that video a couple of times, and then it gets accomplished sometimes. Sometimes I make it worse. So again, that is TP3, some control over time, path, place, or pace. And then before we move on to distance learning, we want to remember that the main pieces of the learning environment are still the same. A teacher is still the driver of instruction based off of data, especially in the small group setting. The technology is being leveraged to differentiate and provide immediate feedback to students, which is what they need, right? It's frustrating for a student to do something, to work on something, to really put their effort in and then not get information until a day later, 2 days later, a week later, when the teacher has a chance to grade those assignments. So getting that information, immediate feedback to really know, am I on the right path or do I need to step back and relearn this? And then all the activities are still going to be tied to your TEKS. Rigor is still going to be included. Like all those basics are still included, regardless of which model you go with. So again, the model that we're doing today is going to be an individual rotation. Right now, you would think of this as like the mini lesson or the direct teach before I pop you into your rotation. There are several in the blended learning models. You can click that once you get your slide deck. You can walk through a more detailed description of each one of those. But today we're doing the individual rotation. And again, you see this will be on your task card later, or learning menu rather, later. So let's dive into what that individual rotation would look like. I chose this model one because it's the easiest for us in this session to do and have our own time. But then also this model would work great for districts as you go into next year, knowing that you would have some time possibly at home and some time at school. This model allows students to walk through the stations with individual schedules. Again, we'll talk more about that in a moment. But unlike the traditional model where students, like in a station rotation, they would actually move physically from one station to the next. When they rotate here, you're rotating the activities or you're rotating the task that you're doing. So in this case, that's the playlist or the learning menu that you're going through. Right now, this could be done at home, just like you're going to do here in a moment. You're not physically, in my house or in my classroom. And then this diagram is a little deceiving in that this is not 4 different teachers. That would be a nearly impossible task to do. But this is rather the same teacher that could serve in different roles. So again, right now we would be here. So we're doing a direct instruction. I'm giving you kind of the prior knowledge that you need. And then here in a moment, I'm going to throw you into your playlist or learning menu for your own time. And then, as I mentioned before, this model is a great way to incorporate your distance learning model, knowing that maybe if something happens later in the year, I won't be able to see my students face to face. So we could still incorporate this. So if teachers start to do a playlist or learning menu at the very beginning of the year, then if they do get thrown into this model where they have to just be at home, this is not a total shift in their thinking. Like we can just keep the ball rolling, just pick it right back up and keep going from home. So let's talk about distance learning real quick. So we mentioned earlier how distance learning is a little bit different than blended learning, with knowing that it's just at home. And in that case, then distance learning could really be 2 ways for students. One is synchronous, where it's happening live. I would say that what we're doing right now is not really live, because you would be able to fast forward, rewind, go back and watch it. Although you are watching it live technically, in the series of the sessions, but this is not really synchronous. Synchronous would be getting on the Zoom, right? Or Google Meets and actually having a conversation with students just through the screen though. And there is a start and an end time, a hard start and end time for that. Asynchronous is on your own schedule. So anytime, any place, you just need an internet, you need a device, and you need the link or access to whatever you're trying to get to. Many times asynchronous is self-paced. The student, or like in the COVID environment, the parent was kind of helping pace the student, but the student is the driver and independent. Um, and it's to note that asynchronous can be in many different ways. Pre-recorded videos, as you're seeing now, articles, activities, assignments. It's not just one way to do it. And I think here's where it got a little bit hairy for teachers that were new to this, because they started hearing words like screencast and Flipgrid and adaptive software, and it was a little bit overwhelming. So I think as board members, really setting clear expectations for what we would like to see parents and students to know what these mediums are, so that and I'll talk about that in the lessons learned in a second, but really know what these mediums are so they have a clear understanding of what's expected of them if they go to that distance learning model. And really, for distance learning to be effective, both of these are happening, right? Daily check-ins with your students, workshops, office hours, like constantly being able to connect back to them when they need that help. So let's pause real quick and talk about traditional education and the constraints and how maybe blended and distance learning can help to alleviate some of those. These are our constraints, typically our time, the space that we have in our rooms, the routines, communication that we have back and forth with students and with parents, and then accountability. How do we know if we're getting where we want to go? The main two that we've seen now going into this next year, they're going to be affected, obviously, is space. Do students have to be 6 feet apart? How far do we do our desk? How do we rotate from class to class, right? Those things. And then the other one that's going to be affected the most is routines. Just as teachers, the way we did things before is going to be different, right? The way principals are having to set up their daily schedules is going to be different. How parents are we in a hybrid model, distance model, at home? All those things, it's kind of been thrown up and into the air. And so these are the main two constraints. As board members, we really have to make sure that our decisions don't have any sort of unintended consequences in these two cases for students. The learning experience, the learning environment is still going to continue and be a positive one for students. So what does this look like then between the brick and mortar and the virtual? So at school or at home. And for time, the teacher is managing the schedule when we're at school. The student's really managing the schedule when they're in the distance learning model. For space, the teacher's laying this out. Obviously, at home, this looks totally different, right? Some students, they're the oldest, they've got their own time, own space, their own room. Others, they're little kindergartners, and there may be a bunch of stuff going on that they need help with that space and design. Routines, again, this is guided mostly by the teacher. In the virtual, the teacher is setting it up, and the students are helping to create that routine and that practice in their whatever's best for them at home. And then communication. Communication is pretty standard in the traditional way that we've done things, and now, as we've noticed, the two-way communication is extremely important to set and expect with students and parents. And you'll see that in the lessons learned here in a moment, how some other districts have done a great job of doing this. And then accountability. The teacher is the main driver, monitoring the student progress. In the virtual setting now, the student is many times working at their own pace independently, and the teacher is not there to monitor progress quite as often. Regardless, as we go through this, it's important to know that in the virtual setting that it's going to be self-directed. Go back to that question about student agency. How can we leverage technology to help with student agency with students? And in that virtual setting, a big piece is not just the content that we're expecting from students, but then also just the logistical time management responsibilities that they need to learn. So this will be one of the questions for you to reflect on. Which of the constraints have been noticeable to you during this shift in distance learning? Which of these, maybe you have the perspective as a parent, or you have the perspective as just a board member themselves, just listening to the community, and what those constraints have been that have spoken the loudest to you during this last time. So back to the synchronous and asynchronous to kind of really dive deeper into those constraints and what that looks like. Again, this is in the distance learning, but in synchronous time, the teacher is the main owner of that time. In space, the students obviously are going to be wherever they're at their home, but they're controlling rather that space. Routines in the synchronous learning, the teacher is the driver. So just like right now, I'm driving the lesson for you. Communication and accountability, or just slightly off there. However, in the asynchronous, we see a flip, right? So now the time is on the student. That whether you want to call it flex time or individual rotation time, like it's on you to get through, on the student to get through those tasks, as well as space and routines. I think this, as we mentioned before, this is in kind of the lessons learned for us in our districts is we were thrown into that environment. We really didn't have a lot of time to help parents set up those routines. Now we do, right? Now let's reflect back on what went well and what didn't, what was a challenge, and let's really set down expectations for this next year for our district. Communication is going to be relying on the student and accountability because, again, most of this time is self-directed. So lessons learned from the kind of a large school district and a smaller school district. And again, you'll see resources at a national level as well that you'll see in your rotation time. Again, I worked in Dallas ISD, so I've kind of seen this from that perspective a lot. And they did three things really, really well. One was they were clearly connecting with families. And I've seen this in other districts as well. But there was one space that if I was a parent or a student and I wanted to know what's going on this week, or I wanted to know how do I get connected to something I'm unsure of, I really just needed to go to this one website, and it took me there. Again, this is here, so you're going to see that link later in your individual rotation time, and you can explore more in that link there. But that was a great way to really connect with families and the importance that we notice that the parent plays in helping students with their self-directed time. The second thing that you'll see inside that website was a guide, a parent and family guide. So, and in that guide, they not only gave clear direction as to how to get into certain programs, where to go when you needed help, but it was also differentiated for your special needs students, for your gifted and talented students. There were different activities, specific resources for those different students' needs and interests with those families. And then the last piece that was really inspiring was social emotional learning. Sometimes you'll hear it called SEL, has been in the district for a while, but that's really made that jump start, knowing that the students needed that mental health. And even parents, honestly, like everyone could do it as a family because of this change and the stress that it put on so many families. So making mental health really actionable by posting very specific videos that the parents could walk with the students through and do together in kind of fun and fun ways that I felt like were very beneficial for them. The other way is for like a smaller district. So this is Kennedale, where I'm a board member at. We have about 3,000 students. So not like teeny tiny, but definitely smaller than Dallas, who has over 150,000 students. We saw two really beneficial items that students were able to connect to and parents were able to connect to. One was the ease of information that's regardless of where I was on this spectrum of, hey, I'm really nailing this at home learning environment. I've got it down, or look, I have no idea what's going on. I need help. Again, for parents, there was one place to get to that, whether it was questions about technology or questions about grading, things like that they weren't sure about, overall updates and district information specific to the at-home learning curriculum, other resources and technology help. Like there was one place for them to go to. And then the second thing I thought was great was as we jumped into those waters, we realized that stakeholders needed to be partnered in this process. In this case here, this was the grading task force. We had to update our grading policy, much like all the other districts did. And, it's very difficult or troublesome sometimes to make decisions in a vacuum with just a handful of people. because then there are those blind spots that you didn't think about till afterwards. And so I was really proud of my district in this case, sending out those surveys at the student level, the parent and guardian level, and the teacher level, and then being able to share those results back and getting very clear data. What is it that you want? This was from the students, but we talked about, in our case, we do 9 weeks instead of 6 weeks. And so what is it as students do I want? Do I want to count certain grades, not count it? Knowing that in the end, the board members are ultimately approving the decisions from central administration, but this kind of helps to guide our thinking and knowing, is there a blind spot? Is there something that we're missing before we make this decision? Okay, so I think that was a little bit faster than the time I had on there, which is fine. This is going to be your individual rotation time. And as I mentioned before, this is going to be, this is one of the blended learning models. This is a learning menu. And so what you'll do is you'll type in this here. For those that aren't familiar, you can just hit the plus sign there or hit escape and open up a new window. But you'll type that in. It is case sensitive, so it has to be all lowercase, bit.ly/TASB menu 2020. And that'll take you to your own learning menu that'll be for you to use, and then go back in and go through the slide deck. You'll see at the top on there's a screencast video. So click there, watch that video. It'll walk you through the learning menu on what to do. And then you can jump in and get started. And the presentation, this presentation here, the slide deck itself, you'll see it's linked in the learning menu. So I just wanted to say that this is what we were just in. This was the individual rotation, but we were just in that direct instruction time. You are now going into your own time. So if we were thinking about this next year and you were students in my class, this could be time in class that you're learning, and then this may be time at home. So if you're doing a blended model where you're at school Monday and Wednesday, and you're at home Tuesday and Thursday, you can see as a teacher, I've made one lesson that has covered both my direct instruction and has covered my at home, or not at home, my distance learning instruction. So it doesn't have to be two separate things. That's why I kind of chose this model for you to be immersed in. Now, when you click on that link there, it is going to ask you to make a copy. So that way it's yours. It is yours. You can have it, share it, change it, use it. It's not going to affect anybody else there. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes. We're going to just pause time and actually give you time here to get into that. Again, type in that link, watch the instructional video, and then go back through the slides and see if you can answer some of those questions. I'm going to put 10 minutes here just for us to be able to go through. I'll step off camera and then I'll come back in 10 minutes. All right. well, that may have been a very quick 10 minutes or not. So that link there will live for you. Feel free to go back anytime that you need to. The last thing I'll wrap up before we go to the Q&A time, the live session of Q&A, is just my contact information there. Email, school board email, my school board Twitter and Facebook. I would just say, just like The Rock here, if you've ever seen the movie Jumanji, it's hilarious, but we've got to do this together. We cannot live in silos, districts. I think this is a great opportunity with the changes here for districts to be able to collaborate with other districts, whether they're right next door to each other or finding districts that are the same size or have similar makeups. Like, this is a great time to really hone in on our skills of collaboration and get to improving our practices. Sometimes we have to be kind of nudged in that direction. And I would say that this COVID environment that we all experienced definitely nudged us to do things differently. And so I don't want to stop that momentum. I want us to learn. I would love for us to be able to learn from that and really get better. In this case, in this session, talking about blended learning and distance learning practices to kind of close that student opportunity gap. Using technology to do that is a great way to do that. So I'm going to stop the recording here. I really have no idea what happens after that, but I'm sure someone will direct us in that case here. All right. Thanks for watching.